You will leave this place." The words were not a request. They were chips of ice, carved from a glacier of grief, 5 years in the making. Eleonora stood on the damp cobblestones of Saltwind, the scent of fish and brine clinging to her coarse wool dress, a scent that had become the perfume of her survival. She faced the man she had once vowed to love, honor, and obey, and felt none of it. All that remained was a hollowed-out cavern where her heart used to be. Alistair Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood, looked profoundly out of place. His coat was of a black so deep it seemed to drink the meager seaside light. His boots, though splattered with the mud of the village lanes, were of a leather so fine they cost more than her entire cottage. He was a creature of marble halls and manicured lawns, a god fallen to earth, and the sight of him here, in her gritty, hard-working world, was a violation. "Eleonora, you must listen," he began, his voice a low rumble that once had the power to soothe her. Now it grated on her nerves like a dragging anchor chain. "I did not know. I swear to you I was deceived." She gave a short, bitter laugh that the wind snatched away. "Deceived? You are the one who passed judgment. You are the one who looked at me as if I were something vile you had found on your shoe. You did not even have the decency to cast me out yourself. You sent your aunt." The memory was a physical blow, even now. Lady Beatrice, her face a mask of cold triumph, delivering the Duke's verdict, the forged letter in her hand, the paid physician with his false testimony, and Alistair, her husband, believing it all, believing she had been unfaithful, that the child she carried was not his. He had not even faced her. "That was my greatest failure," Alistair admitted, his proud shoulders slumping with a weariness that seemed to go down to the bone. "A failure I have lived with every single day for 5 years, but I have the proof now. I know what she did." "Proof?" Eleonora's voice was dangerously quiet. "What good is proof to a ghost? The Duchess of Blackwood is dead. I buried her on the road out of London. My name is Nora. I mend nets and I scrub floors at the inn, and I am no one you know." She turned to go, her hand already reaching for the worn wood of her cottage door. She could not bear to look at him, to see the same stormy gray eyes that she saw every morning in the face of her son, to see the ghost of the man she had foolishly, desperately loved. A small voice cut through the tension. "Mama?" They both froze. A boy of nearly 5 years stood in the doorway, his small hand clutching the frame. He had a tangle of dark hair, the same unruly waves as the Duke, and a smudge of dirt on his cheek. But it was his eyes that held Alistair captive. They were perfect, miniature replicas of his own, gray, flecked with silver and filled with a child's open curiosity. The Duke could not breathe. He had imagined it, of course. In his darkest hours, he had allowed himself the torturous fantasy that the child had been his after all, that he had a son or daughter in the world. But to see him, to see the undeniable proof of his own blood staring back at him, was a shock that buckled his knees. And then he saw it, hanging from a simple leather string around the boy's neck, nestled against the plain fabric of his shirt, was a flash of impossible blue, a sapphire, deep as the midnight sea, surrounded by a starburst of diamonds. It was her betrothal ring, the Blackwood sapphire, a ring so famous it had been painted into the portraits of 3 generations of duchesses. He remembered sliding it onto her finger, the cool weight of it a promise of forever. He kept its twin, her simple gold wedding band, in a locked drawer of his desk. He looked at it every night, a sacrament of his guilt. The band she had left on her pillow that terrible night. But this ring, the betrothal ring, was a public declaration. And his son, the son he had denied, was wearing it. The world tilted on its axis. The sound of the gulls, the crash of the waves, the salty wind, it all faded into a roaring silence. He knelt, his fine trousers sinking into the damp grit of the path, heedless of the filth. He was no longer a duke. He was just a man, a father, shattered by the truth. He looked from the ring to the boy's face, then up at Eleonora, whose expression was a fortress of hardened pain. "His name," Alistair rasped, his voice breaking. "What is his name?" Eleonora's jaw tightened. She stepped forward, placing a protective hand on her son's shoulder. "His name is Thomas, and he is my son, mine alone." The 5 years preceding that moment had been a slow, grinding descent into hell for Alistair. The first year had been one of hollow, righteous anger. He had allowed his Aunt Beatrice to cleanse the manor of Eleonora's presence. Her clothes were given away, her favorite books removed from the library, her music room repurposed. Blackwood Manor became silent, sterile, and perfect. It was a tomb. Beatrice had been quietly triumphant, her dominion over the household restored. She had raised Alistair since his parents' death when he was a boy, and she viewed Eleonora as an interloper, a rival for his affections and his power. She had played on his deepest insecurities, his fear of being made a fool of, his ducal pride. The forged letter from a fictitious lover, combined with the testimony of a physician she had bribed to speak of a false timeline of conception, had been the masterstrokes of her campaign. Alistair had wanted to believe it was a lie, a part of him, the part that remembered the quiet joy in Eleonora's eyes when she told him she was with child, screamed that it was impossible. But he was a man ruled by duty and the evidence had been damning. His pride, a brittle and terrible thing, could not withstand the public humiliation he imagined. So he had retreated behind a wall of cold fury and let Beatrice handle the sordid details. He had banished his wife and his unborn child, with a silence that was more brutal than any shouted word. But the silence that followed her departure was not the peaceful, orderly silence he expected. It was a suffocating void. The manor, once a home, became a vast, echoing museum of his failure. The scent of beeswax and lemon oil could not cover the stench of rot in his soul. He began to notice things. The way Beatrice's smile never quite reached her eyes. The way she would subtly steer conversations away from any mention of the past. The way the servants flinched when he entered a room, their pity a constant, unspoken accusation. He started drinking, not in public, but alone, in his study at night. He would unlock the top drawer of his great mahogany desk and pull out the simple gold band she had left behind. Cor unum, one heart. The inscription mocked him. He would hold the ring, the metal warmed by his hand, and remember. He remembered her laughter, a sound like wind chimes that no longer graced his halls. He remembered the feel of her hand in his, small and warm. He remembered the fierce intelligence in her eyes, an intelligence he had taken for granted, and had ultimately insulted with his blind trust in another. The doubt began as a whisper and grew into a roar. After 2 years of this self-imposed torment, he did what he should have done in the beginning. He started to investigate. He did not use the family solicitors. This required discretion. He hired a man from London, a former Bow Street runner named Davies, a man with shrewd eyes and a reputation for unearthing secrets others thought long buried. The investigation was slow, painstaking work. The physician had vanished, paid handsomely to disappear to the continent. The supposed lover from the letters did not exist. It was a phantom, a name on a piece of forged stationery. For 2 more years, Davies chased shadows and followed cold trails. Alistair's hope dwindled, replaced by a grim, joyless determination. He had to know the truth, even if it damned him completely. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. A disgruntled former lady's maid of Beatrice's, dismissed for a minor infraction, held a grudge. For a small sum, she remembered seeing her mistress practicing handwriting, copying from a sample of Eleonora's script. She remembered Beatrice meeting secretly with the physician. The pieces began to click into place. Davies eventually tracked the doctor to a shabby boarding house in Paris, riddled with debt and disease. For the promise of a comfortable end, The man confessed everything. He provided names, dates, and details of the payments from Beatrice's personal accounts. The truth was a physical sickness. Alistair had not been deceived by a stranger. He had been betrayed by the woman who had raised him, the woman he had trusted implicitly. And in that trust, he had committed the greatest sin of his life. He had destroyed the one person who had ever seen past the title to the man beneath. He had thrown away his wife, his son, his happiness, all for the sake of a pride that now seemed like a fool's cheap armor. Davies's final report came with a tentative location. A woman matching Eleonora's description, going by the name Nora, had been traced to a remote fishing village on the coast. She had a son, a boy of 4, nearly 5. The timeline was perfect. Alistair had set out at once, a storm of hope and terror raging within him. What would he find? A woman broken and destitute. A child who hated the very idea of him. He did not know what he would say, what he could possibly offer that could mend a wound so deep. He only knew he had to try. He had to see her. He had to see his son. For Eleonora, the first few months had been a blur of terror. She had fled with what little cash she had in her private accounts, a few pieces of jewelry she could sell, and the clothes on her back. She had left the wedding ring, a deliberate severing. But the betrothal ring, the first promise he had ever made her, she could not part with. It was too heavy with memory, both beautiful and agonizing. She traveled by public coach, hiding her face, her fine fabrics a beacon of her former life. She traded her silk dress for a servant's sturdy wool in a grimy London market, the transaction feeling like a shedding of skin. She was no longer a duchess. She was a woman alone, pregnant, and running for her life. She chose Saltwind for its remoteness, a place so insignificant it was unlikely anyone would ever think to look for her there. The village was harsh and unwelcoming at first. The people were suspicious of an outsider with soft hands and a cultured voice. But desperation was a powerful teacher. She found a room at the Salty Dog, the local inn, run by a sharp-eyed widow named Martha. Eleonora, now Nora, offered to work for her keep. She scrubbed floors until her hands were raw. She washed dishes until her back ached. She learned to cook simple, hearty food for the fishermen who frequented the inn. Martha watched her with a critical but not unkind eye. She saw the grief in Nora's gaze, but she also saw a core of steel. She never asked about Nora's past. In a place like Saltwind, many people were running from something. It was enough that she worked hard and was honest. When Thomas was born, with the help of Martha and the local midwife, it was both a joy and a terror. He was so small, so perfect. And he was the spitting image of Alistair, his dark hair, his gray eyes. He was her secret, her treasure, and her constant, painful reminder. Raising him became the sole purpose of her existence. She would protect him, provide for him, and ensure he grew up knowing he was loved unconditionally, something she now believed his father was incapable of. As Thomas grew, she saved every spare shilling, eventually renting a small, damp cottage near the cliffs. She took on more work, mending nets for the fishing fleet. Her hands, once accustomed to embroidery and piano keys, became calloused and strong. She learned the rhythms of the tide, the names of the constellations, the signs of an approaching storm. The Duchess was a dream, a fairy tale she had once read. Nora, the net mender, the mother, was real. She kept the betrothal ring in a small wooden box. She feared selling it, as it was too recognizable, but she also could not bear to look at it. One day, when Thomas was 3, he found the box. His eyes had lit up at the sparkling jewel. "Pretty, Mama." An idea took hold. It was a way to keep it safe, to keep it close, without having it on her own hand. She found a sturdy leather cord and strung the ring onto it, tying it securely around his neck. It was her last link to a life that was gone, and she entrusted it to the only person she had left. It became his treasure, his shiny stone. He never took it off. She taught him to read and write. She told him stories, not of dukes and castles, but of brave sailors and clever fish. She told him his father was a man who had sailed away on a long journey, a simple lie to shield him from a complicated, ugly truth. She built a life for them, a small, fragile life, held together by love and sheer force of will. And then, after 5 years of peace, the storm had come for her. Alistair, standing on her path, bringing the whole wretched past crashing down upon her. Now, in the aftermath of his arrival, the cottage felt smaller, the air thicker. Alistair had not left. To her shock and fury, he had taken a room at the Salty Dog. The entire village was buzzing with the news of the grand gentleman who had arrived in a private coach. He made no secret of his purpose. He was there for Nora. He did not approach her again directly. He seemed to understand that words were useless. Instead, he began a silent, relentless siege. The next morning, a stack of perfectly cut firewood appeared by her door. The day after, a basket of fresh vegetables from an inland farm, things she could never afford. A fisherman stopped her on the path, tipping his cap. "The gentleman paid me for my whole catch, ma'am. Said you and the boy should have the best of it." Each gesture was a stone dropped into the still, deep pool of her resentment. She wanted to hate him for it, to see it as a rich man's way of buying forgiveness. But the actions were small, practical, and thoughtful. They were the things a husband, a father, would do. It was a language she had forgotten he could speak. Thomas, oblivious to the turmoil, was fascinated by the tall, sad man who watched him from a distance. Alistair never came too close, but he would stand at the edge of the beach while Thomas played, his posture one of profound longing. One afternoon, Thomas was trying to fly a kite he had made from driftwood and old sailcloth. The wind was tricky, and he kept stumbling, the kite crashing to the sand. Eleonora watched from the doorway, her heart aching. After several failed attempts, Alistair slowly walked onto the beach. He knelt in the sand, his voice soft. "May I help you?" Thomas looked from the stranger to his mother. Eleonora gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. She did not know why. Perhaps she was tired of fighting. Perhaps she was curious to see what he would do. Alistair showed Thomas how to read the wind, how to hold the string, when to let it out and when to pull it in. He did not do it for him. He guided the boy's hands with his own, his touch gentle. Together they got the kite airborne. It soared into the sky, a tiny patch of white against the vast blue. Thomas shrieked with delight, his face alight with pure joy. Alistair looked over at Eleonora, and for a fleeting moment, the Duke was gone. She saw only a man, his face filled with a desperate, heartbreaking hope. He was not trying to win her over with jewels or promises. He was showing her, through this small, simple act, the kind of father he could have been, the kind of father he wanted to be. The wall around her heart did not crumble, but a single, tiny crack appeared. A week after his arrival, Alistair sent a message via Martha. He had a visitor he wished for her to meet. He would not come to the cottage. He asked if she would meet him in the private parlor of the inn. He said it was a matter of justice. Eleonora was wary. Justice was a word that had no meaning for her anymore, but Martha urged her to go. "The man is eating himself alive with regret, Nora. Whatever he has to say, perhaps it is time you heard it." She left Thomas with a neighbor and walked to the inn, her stomach in knots. Alistair was waiting for her, along with a thin, gray-haired man with intelligent eyes. He was introduced as Mr. Davies. "Your Grace," Davies said, bowing his head slightly to her. The title was a shock. No one had called her that in 5 years. "Please, do not," she said, her voice strained. Alistair gestured to the table where a collection of papers was laid out. "Eleonora, I told you I had proof. This is it. I did not ask you to take my word for it. I am asking you to look at the evidence." For the next hour, Davies calmly and methodically walked her through his investigation. He presented a signed, witnessed confession from the physician, detailing the bribe from Lady Beatrice. He showed her bank ledgers that traced the payment from Beatrice's accounts. He produced the statement from the former lady's maid about the forged letters. It was a cold, irrefutable dismantling of the lie that had destroyed her life. Each document was a nail in Beatrice's coffin. Eleonora read the physician's confession, his words painting a vivid picture of her own humiliation from the other side. She felt a wave of nausea. All this time she had directed her hatred solely at Alistair. He was the one who had believed the lie, the one who had condemned her. But she had never truly understood the depth and malice of the conspiracy against her. Beatrice had not just whispered doubts. She had constructed an entire false reality. When Davies was finished, a heavy silence filled the room. Eleonora stared at the papers, her mind reeling. It did not erase Alistair's failure. He had still chosen to believe the lie over her, but it recontextualized it. He had not been a willing participant in her destruction. He had been a fool, a proud, blind fool, manipulated by a person he trusted completely. "What have you done with her?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "She is no longer at Blackwood," Alistair said, his tone devoid of emotion. "I have provided her with a small property in the north and an allowance that will keep her from starving. But she is forbidden from ever setting foot on Blackwood land again. She is forbidden from using my name. As far as society is concerned, Lady Beatrice Beaumont has ceased to exist." It was a punishment worse than prison for a woman like Beatrice, for whom status and power were like oxygen. It was a social death. "I did not do it for revenge," Alistair added quietly. "I did it because the lie had to be unmade. The poison had to be drawn out." Eleonora stood up, her legs unsteady. "I need to go." She could not process this here, in front of him. She needed the wind and the sea and the solid ground of her own small world. She walked out of the inn and back towards her cottage, her thoughts a tangled mess. The evidence had not healed her, but it had shifted something fundamental inside her. The story she had told herself for 5 years, the one where she was the victim of a cruel, unfeeling husband, was no longer the whole truth. The truth was more complex, more tragic. They had both been victims of a masterful betrayal. His sin was not malice, but weakness, a profound, unforgivable weakness that had cost them everything. But was it truly unforgivable? She reached her cottage and saw Thomas sitting on the stoop, carefully polishing his shiny stone with the hem of his shirt. He looked up and smiled, a pure, uncomplicated expression of love. He was the one good, true thing to come out of all this wreckage. Could she deny him a father, now that she knew the truth? Could she deny Alistair a son, when his longing for the boy was so painfully real? The questions were a weight on her soul, heavier than any she had carried before. Forgiveness felt like a distant country she had no map for. But for the first time in 5 long years, she felt a flicker of something that was not anger or grief. It was a faint, terrifying glimmer of possibility. The days that followed the meeting with Davies settled into a strange, new rhythm. Alistair remained at the inn, a quiet, constant presence in the village. He no longer left gifts at her door, as if understanding that such gestures were no longer enough. Instead, he sought to make himself useful in a way that money could not. He helped the fishermen haul their boats ashore, his fine coat replaced by a borrowed, rough-spun tunic. He was clumsy at first, his muscles unaccustomed to the labor, but he was persistent. The villagers, who had initially viewed him with suspicion, began to regard him with a grudging respect. They saw not a duke playing at being a commoner, but a man performing a quiet, determined penance. He spoke to Eleonora only when necessary, his tone always respectful, his eyes always asking a question he did not dare voice. He focused his attention on Thomas. He never presumed the rights of a father. He behaved like a man courting a child's trust. He taught Thomas how to skip stones across the water. his patient instruction a stark contrast to his own restless energy. He told him stories of the stars, naming the constellations she had taught herself, but adding ancient myths and legends she had never known. Eleonora watched them from a distance, her heart a battleground of conflicting emotions. A part of her resented his easy connection with their son, the effortless way he was slipping into a role he had abdicated for 5 years. But another, deeper part of her ached at the sight. This was what she had always wanted for her child: a father's strength, a father's knowledge, a father's love. One evening, a fierce storm blew in from the sea. The wind howled like a banshee, and rain lashed against her small cottage, finding its way through every crack in the old wood. The roof, which had been in need of repair for months, began to leak. A steady drip, then a trickle, began to fall near Thomas's small bed. She moved his cot, but another leak started nearby. Soon the floor was covered in puddles. As she was frantically trying to mop up the water with old rags, there was a loud banging on the door. She opened it to find Alistair, soaked to the skin, his hair plastered to his forehead. "The roof at the innkeeper's cottage has failed," he said, shouting over the wind. "Martha said yours was old. You and the boy cannot stay here tonight. It is not safe." Before she could protest, he was inside, his presence filling the tiny room. He gently wrapped a sleeping Thomas in a thick blanket and lifted him into his arms. "Gather what you need," he commanded, his ducal authority returning in the face of the crisis. "I have my coach waiting. It is sheltered in the inn stable. It will take you there. You will take my room. It is the driest in the building." She found herself obeying without thought. The raw power of the storm made arguments feel petty and small. She grabbed a small bag of clothes and followed him out into the maelstrom. The journey to the inn was a blur of wind and water. He settled her and a still sleeping Thomas in his room, which was, as he had promised, warm and dry. A fire crackled in the hearth. "Where will you go?" she asked, watching him drip onto the floorboards. "I will help the others. There are boats that need securing." He paused at the door, his hand on the latch. His gaze was intense. "Please, Eleonora, be safe." He left before she could answer. She stood in the center of the room, the finest room in Saltwind, and felt a profound sense of dislocation. She listened to the storm rage outside, and for the first time, she felt not fear, but a strange sense of security. He had not sent a servant. He had come himself. He had carried his son through the storm. He had given them his shelter and gone back out into the danger. She put Thomas to bed and sat in a chair by the fire, watching the flames. The anger that had been her constant companion for 5 years felt distant, its sharp edges worn smooth by the events of the past weeks. In its place was a vast, weary sadness. Sadness for the years they had lost. Sadness for the man her husband could have been, and the woman she had been forced to become. The storm broke at dawn. Eleonora woke with a start, realizing she had fallen asleep in the chair. The room was quiet, save for the gentle breathing of her son. She went to the window. The sky was washed clean, a pale, fragile blue. The village was a scene of devastation. Nets were torn, a small boat was smashed against the rocks, and debris littered the cobblestones. The men of the village, Alistair among them, were already at work, beginning the long process of cleaning up. He looked exhausted. His face was streaked with grime. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, but he worked with a steady, relentless energy. She watched him for a long time, this Duke of Blackwood, hauling broken timbers with common fishermen. He was not above them. He was one of them, sharing their burden. Later that day, she found him sitting alone on the sea wall, staring out at the becalmed water. She walked over and stood beside him. For a long time, neither of them spoke. "The cottage roof is destroyed," she said finally, breaking the silence. "The east wall has collapsed." He nodded, not looking at her. I know. I will have it rebuilt, stronger than before. No, she said softly. He turned then, his face etched with confusion and hurt. Eleonora, I must provide for you. For him. It is the least I can do. You do not understand, Alistair. It was the first time she had used his name. The sound of it hung in the air between them, a fragile bridge across a vast canyon. His breath hitched. My life is not here anymore, she continued, her voice gaining strength. This place, Saltwind, it saved me. It taught me how to be strong. But it was a refuge, not a home. My home, our son's home, is with his family. He stared at her, his gray eyes wide with a dawning, incredulous hope. He looked like a man starving, being offered a feast. He did not seem to dare believe it. What are you saying? He whispered. I am saying that Thomas deserves to know his father, and he deserves to know who he is. He is not just the son of Nora the net mender. He is Thomas Beaumont, the heir to the dukedom of Blackwood. She took a deep breath, the salt air filling her lungs. And his mother is the Duchess. I've been running from that name for 5 years. I think it is time I started running towards it. Tears welled in Alistair's eyes. He did not try to hide them. They traced paths through the grime on his cheeks. He stood up slowly, as if afraid a sudden movement might shatter the moment. He reached out, not to touch her, but just holding his hand in the space between them, a silent offering. Can you forgive me? He asked, his voice thick with unshed emotion. I know I do not deserve it. I will spend the rest of my life earning it. But can you? Is it possible? Eleonora looked at his outstretched hand. She thought of the cold, proud man he had been. She thought of the broken, penitent man he had become. She thought of their son, who had his father's eyes and her own resilience. The future was a terrifying, unknown country. But for the first time, she did not want to face it alone. She placed her hand in his. His skin was rough and calloused from the work, so different from the smooth, aristocratic hands she remembered. It felt real, strong. Forgiveness is not a single act, Alistair, she said, her voice clear and steady. It is a choice you make every day. I am willing to make that choice, if you are. Every day, he vowed, his fingers closing around hers, holding on as if he were a drowning man and she was his only hope of shore. Every day for the rest of our lives. Returning to Blackwood was like stepping into a half-remembered dream. The grand facade of the manor, which had once intimidated her, now seemed merely large. The vast, polished halls, which had once felt cold and empty, now echoed with the sound of a small boy's excited chatter. Alistair had sent word ahead. The staff was lined up to greet them, their faces a mixture of shock and curiosity. Eleonora saw the pity in some of their eyes, the respect in others. She held her head high, her hand holding Thomas's, and walked into her home as if she had only been gone a day. The changes were subtle, but significant. The oppressive scent of Beatrice's lilies was gone, replaced by the clean, fresh smell of lavender and rose. In the great hall, the heavy velvet drapes had been pulled back, letting sunlight stream in, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The house felt like it could breathe again. Alistair led her to the library, the one room that had always been his sanctuary. It was just as she remembered it, lined floor to ceiling with books, the air thick with the scent of leather and old paper. He walked to his desk, the one where he had spent so many nights drowning in regret. He produced a small, ornate key and unlocked the top drawer. He reached inside and pulled out her wedding ring. The simple gold band gleamed in the light. He held it out to her on the palm of his hand. Cor unum, he said softly. One heart. I broke that vow. I shattered it. I do not know if it can ever be made whole. Eleonora looked at the ring. It was a symbol of their broken past. Then she looked at her son, who was curiously examining a large globe in the corner of the room. He was the symbol of their future. She reached up and untied the leather string from around Thomas's neck. The betrothal ring, with its brilliant sapphire, felt heavy in her hand. She slipped it onto the third finger of her right hand. Then she picked up the wedding band from Alistair's palm and slowly, deliberately, slid it onto her left hand. It fit perfectly. "No," she said, meeting his gaze. "It cannot be made whole in the way it was before. We are not the same people who first made those vows. I am not the naive girl you married, and you are not the proud, unyielding man who sent me away. We will have to build something new." She held up her hands, the two rings glittering. "The promise," she said, touching the sapphire. "And the vow." She touched the gold band. "They belong together, just as the past and the future belong together. We cannot erase what happened, Alistair, but we can learn from it. We can be better." Life at Blackwood settled into a new, unfamiliar rhythm. It was not easy. There were days when the ghost of Beatrice's betrayal hung between them, a cold shadow. There were moments when a careless word or a distant look from Alistair would send a chill of old fear through her. But he was relentless in his efforts to prove his change. He listened. It was the most profound change of all. He asked for her opinion on the management of the estate, on the welfare of the tenants, on the redecorating of the manor. He treated her not as his duchess, but as his partner. He ceded power to her, not as a gift, but as her right. Together they started a school for the tenants' children on the estate lands, a project Eleonora had dreamed of years ago, only to be dismissed by Beatrice as a frivolous waste of money. He spent hours with Thomas. He taught him to ride a pony, to fish in the estate's river, to name the trees in the ancient woods. He read to him every night, his deep voice filling the nursery with tales of adventure and heroism. In his son's eyes, Alistair saw not judgment or recrimination, but simple, unconditional love. It was a gift that humbled him daily. One afternoon, months after their return, Eleonora found him in the long gallery, standing before her portrait. It had been painted in the first year of their marriage. It showed a young woman with hopeful eyes, dressed in pale blue silk, a tentative smile on her lips. The portrait had been covered with a dust sheet during her absence. Now it was uncovered, cleaned, and hung in its place of honor. "I used to hate this painting," Alistair said without turning around. "It reminded me of everything I had lost, of the woman I failed to protect." She came to stand beside him. She was very young. She did not know her own strength. "No," he said, finally turning to face her. His eyes were clear and full of a deep, abiding love that she was finally beginning to trust. She knew her strength. I was just too blind to see it. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his calloused fingers a familiar, comforting weight. "Thank you, Eleonora," he whispered, "for coming back, for giving me a chance to be the man you always deserved." She leaned into his touch, the warmth of his hand chasing away the last of the chill that had lingered in her soul for so long. The past was a part of their story, a landscape of scars they would always carry, but it was no longer their prison. Later that evening, they sat in the garden as twilight painted the sky in shades of violet and rose. Thomas was chasing fireflies on the lawn, his laughter echoing in the quiet air. The scent of night blooming jasmine hung sweetly between them. This was the peace she had never thought to know again, a quiet, simple, and profound happiness. It was not a fairy tale ending. It was something far better. It was real. It was earned. And it was theirs.